all began with dust and forgotten memories. I was clearing out the attic, a weekend project to declutter my life, when I found a moldy cardboard box labeled Summer '98. Inside, nestled between crayon drawings and a seashell collection, were the photos, faded, glossy squares of a life I barely remembered. There we were, my family, 20 years younger, squinting in the summer sun. We were at the edge of the Blackwood Pine Reserve, a place we used to hike. My brother and I were grinning, missing our front teeth, holding half-melted ice cream cones. My parents stood behind us, arms around each other. It was a perfect, cliché family photo. I smiled, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. Then my eyes drifted to the background, just past the line of pine trees, deep in the shadows where the light couldn't reach. Someone was standing there. At first I thought it was just another hiker, but I kept looking, and a cold, prickling sensation crawled up my spine. The figure was wrong. It was too tall, impossibly slender, with limbs that seemed to stretch longer than they should. It wore a suit, a stark black funeral suit in the middle of a forest on a hot summer day. But the face, God, the face, there wasn't one. It wasn't blurred or in shadow. It was a smooth, pale, featureless canvas of white, a complete and utter blankness where a person's eyes and mouth and nose should be. It wasn't a mask. It was just nothing. I dropped the photo. My heart was hammering against my ribs. It had to be a trick of the light, a smudge on the negative, a weird mannequin someone had left in the woods as a prank. I picked it up again, my hand trembling. But no matter how I angled it, the faceless man remained. He was just there, watching. How? How had we never noticed? We stood there, a happy family posing for a picture, completely oblivious to the silent, impossible thing observing us from the trees. And as I stared at its blank head, an even more terrifying question began to claw its way into my mind. After all these years, is it still watching? I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was a photographic anomaly, double exposure, a water stain, anything but the truth my gut was screaming at me. I even scanned the photo into my computer, zooming in until the image dissolved into a meaningless cluster of pixels. But the digital noise couldn't erase the shape of it. The tall, thin man in the black suit, the blank white void where his face should be. I put the photo back in the box, pushed the box into the darkest corner of the attic, and tried to forget. But you can't just unsee something like that. The feeling started a few days later. It was subtle at first, like a faint hum just below the threshold of hearing. It was the sensation of eyes on the back of my neck when I was walking home from work, the kind that makes you turn around to find nothing but an empty street. I'd be sitting in my living room, the curtains drawn, and get a sudden overwhelming urge to check the locks on the doors. I'd pause in the middle of washing dishes, absolutely certain that someone was standing on the other side of the kitchen window, just out of sight. Sleep became a luxury. I'd jolt awake in the dead of night, heart pounding, convinced I had heard a branch snap in the yard or a floorboard creak downstairs. But there was never anything there. Just the familiar groan of the house settling and the lonely whistle of the wind. My reflection in the dark windows started to spook me. The shadows in my own home began to take on new, elongated shapes. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, haunted by a feeling I couldn't prove. My friends told me I was just stressed, working too hard. "You need a vacation," they'd say. But it wasn't stress. This was different. This was a cold, constant, and specific dread. It felt like a predator's gaze. It felt active. It felt like that thing from the photograph had stepped out of the faded image and into the periphery of my world, always watching, always waiting. The question wasn't if I was being followed anymore. The question was, what was it waiting for? Then came the cough. It wasn't a sick cough, not the kind you get with a cold or flu. There was no phlegm, no sore throat. It was a dry, violent, hacking sound that would erupt from my chest without any warning. I'd be in a quiet meeting at work, and suddenly my body would be seized by a fit of these harsh, barking coughs, leaving me breathless and my colleagues staring with concern. At night, it would jolt me from whatever shallow sleep I'd managed to find. I went to a doctor, then a specialist. They ran every test imaginable, X-rays, allergy panels, scopes. They all came back clean. "Your lungs are perfectly healthy," one doctor told me, looking genuinely perplexed. Maybe it's just a nervous tic. But I knew it wasn't. The strangest part, the part I couldn't tell any doctor for fear of being committed, was the sound that came with it. It wasn't just the sound of the cough itself. Just before a fit would begin, and during the worst of it, I'd hear a noise inside my own head. It sounded like radio static, a low, crackling buzz, like a station tuned to a dead frequency. The harder I coughed, the louder the static would get. A wash of white noise that drowned out everything else. It felt like my own body was a broken receiver, trying to tune into a signal I was never meant to hear. It was an invasive, parasitic feeling. The static wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. It felt like the audio equivalent of that blank face in the photograph. An empty, meaningless signal that was somehow full of intent. I was being worn down, physically and mentally. The feeling of being watched had now been joined by a physical symptom that no one could explain, a sickness that seemed to originate from nowhere. How do you cure an illness when the only symptom is a sound that only you can hear? The cough wasn't the sickness. I was beginning to understand that. It was just the first sign that something was breaking inside me. The feeling of being watched was no longer confined to the physical world. It began to bleed into my digital life, infecting the technology I relied on to stay connected. My laptop, a reliable machine I'd had for years, started to act erratically. It would be humming along fine, and then the screen would freeze, the fan would abruptly cut out, and it would reboot without warning. No blue screen of death, no error message, just a sudden jarring reset, forcing me to lose whatever I was working on. It happened once, then twice, then it became a daily occurrence. The IT guy at work ran diagnostics and found nothing wrong. Maybe a power surge, he suggested, but we both knew that was a weak guess. My phone was worse. It became a useless brick of glass and metal. I'd have full bars of signal one moment, and the next, in the middle of a call, it would drop to no service. It happened in my apartment, in the middle of downtown, places where the signal was always perfect. It was like a personal dead zone had formed around me, a bubble of silence that I couldn't escape. Then came the flash. I was working late, staring at a blank Word document, the white screen glowing in the dark room. For a split second, less than a heartbeat, the cursor vanished. The entire screen glitched, and a shape tore across the white page. It was a smear of corrupted data, a vertical gash of black pixels that was unnaturally long and thin. It looked like a dark suit, stretched and distorted by a digital scream. And in that same instant, the static in my head buzzed, louder than it ever had before, a sharp crackle of electricity that made my teeth ache. Then it was gone. I was just staring at a blank document again, but I knew what I had seen. This was no longer passive observation. It wasn't just following me or making me sick. It was reaching through the screen. It was trying to get in. The glitch on my screen was the breaking point. It was no longer a feeling or a sound. It was an image, a deliberate act. My fear, once a creeping mist, had now solidified into a sharp, cold certainty. I wasn't just paranoid, I was being hunted. Sleep became an impossibility. My nights were spent in the cold blue glow of my laptop screen, fueled by caffeine and raw terror. I plunged into the deepest, darkest rabbit holes of the internet. My search history became a litany of madness. Tall man in suit woods, man with no face, static sound in head, unexplained coughing fits, feeling of being watched constantly. For hours I waded through dead-end forums and crackpot theories. And then I found it. A single post on an obscure paranormal message board from a decade ago. It was a story, written by a user who had since been deleted, describing the exact same things: the impossible height, the blank face, the electronic disturbances, the sickness, and the post gave it a name. Slender Man. The word itself felt dangerous to read. Suddenly I wasn't falling down a rabbit hole anymore. I was at the bottom of a massive dark cavern filled with echoes of other victims. There were hundreds of stories. Creepypastas, they called them. There were doctored photos, just like mine. There were fragmented video series. All of them described the same entity, the same methods, the same slow, agonizing erosion of sanity. It had a mythology, a history written by 1,000 anonymous strangers on the internet. For a moment, I felt a surge of validation. I wasn't crazy. This was real. But that relief was quickly swallowed by a far more profound horror. Before, I was haunted by an unknown thing. Now I knew its name, and knowing its name didn't give me power. It just gave me the vocabulary to describe my own destruction. I wasn't discovering a way to fight back. I was reading the case files of all the people who had already lost. Knowing the name was a curse. It gave a shape to the dread, a focus for my terror. And with that focus, I started to see the signs. In the lore I consumed during those sleepless nights, one symbol kept appearing, scrawled in the margins of the stories and flashing for a single frame in the videos. A simple, stark icon, a circle with a bold X drawn through it. The operator symbol, they called it. A sigil of the faceless thing, a warning, a mark, and then I began to see it in my world. The first time was condensation on the bathroom mirror after a shower. As the steam started to clear, I saw it traced in the fog on the glass, a perfect circle with an X inside. I flinched back, my heart seizing. My first thought was that I had done it myself, unconsciously, a product of my frayed nerves. I wiped it away with a frantic sweep of my hand and told myself that's all it was. But then I saw it again, scratched into the paint of a park bench I walked past every day, carved into the bark of a tree on my street. It was faint, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it, and I was always looking now. The symbol started to haunt my periphery, a brand seared into my reality. It was on a dusty car window in a parking garage. It was the pattern a leaky faucet left in the bottom of my sink. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a language. It was a claim. The feeling of being watched had evolved. Now I felt like I was being tagged, like a specimen in a horrifying experiment. He wasn't just following me anymore. He was marking his territory, and that territory was my life, my path, my world. Every time I saw it, the static in my head would hum with a low, possessive energy. It was his way of telling me, without a face or a voice, that there was no escape. The circle was my world, and the X was him crossing it out. The next stage of my decay was not an addition, but a subtraction. It was the theft of time itself. It began one morning when I woke up not in my bed, but on the sofa in my living room. I was still fully dressed in yesterday's clothes. That was disorienting enough. But what pushed a spike of ice into my gut was the state of my shoes. They were caked in thick dark mud, with dead leaves clinging to the laces. I had no memory of leaving my apartment. I remembered coming home from work, locking the door, eating a meal I couldn't taste, and then nothing. A complete, featureless black hole in my memory until the moment I woke up to the pale morning light shivering on the sofa. My muscles ached with a deep, throbbing exhaustion, the kind you get after a long, strenuous hike. Frantically, I checked the door. The deadbolt was still locked from the inside. How did I get back in? Where had I been? The questions hammered at my mind, but the answers were in a vault I couldn't access. There was just a blank space, an empty tape. This wasn't like forgetting a dream. This was like a chunk of my life had been surgically removed. It happened again a few nights later, and then again. The gaps in my memory grew larger, sometimes an hour, sometimes 3. I'd wake up in the middle of a task with no idea how I started it. I once found myself standing in the park across the street at 3 a.m., freezing in just a t-shirt, with no recollection of how I got there. I was losing control of my own body. It was being taken for joy rides, while I was locked away somewhere in the dark of my own mind. I was no longer just a victim being watched. I was becoming a puppet, and the most terrifying question of all began to surface. During those lost hours, what was I doing? You can't carry a nightmare of this magnitude alone. It starts to buckle your knees, to crack your foundations. I was losing time. My health was deteriorating, and I felt a constant, paralyzing fear. I had to tell someone. I had to make someone believe me. I started with my best friend, Dave. We met at a noisy bar, and I thought maybe the public setting would keep me grounded. I laid it all out for him. The photograph, the feeling of being watched, the electronic glitches, the memory loss. I watched his expression carefully as I spoke, hoping for a flicker of recognition, of belief. All I saw was a deep, furrowed concern. He put his hand on my shoulder. "Man," he said softly, "you're completely burned out. You've been working too hard. Your mind is playing tricks on you. This is what exhaustion does." He meant to be comforting, but every rational explanation felt like a dismissal. He was hearing the symptoms, but he wasn't listening to the cause. Desperate, I called my older sister. I was less coherent this time, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. On the other end of the line, there wasn't disbelief. There was a careful, deliberate silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, measured, the way you'd speak to someone standing on a ledge. "Okay," she said, her tone unnervingly calm. "We're going to get you some help. I'll research some doctors, some really good ones." That was the moment I understood the true, insidious nature of the curse. The creature doesn't just kill you. It dismantles your world first. It isolates you. It pushes you so far into the realm of the unbelievable that you become a pariah of sanity. To my friends and family, I wasn't a victim. I was a problem to be solved, a mind to be medicated. They were looking at me, but they were seeing a collection of symptoms. They couldn't see the tall, faceless thing standing right behind me. My prison wasn't just the fear. It was the suffocating loneliness of being the only one who could see the bars. Driven back into the cage of my own home, I started cleaning. It was a frantic, manic kind of cleaning, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that had none. I scrubbed floors, rearranged furniture, anything to keep my hands and mind occupied. Eventually, my frantic energy drove me back to the one place I hadn't touched since finding the photograph: the attic. Tucked away behind a stack of old winter clothes was a dusty footlocker that wasn't mine. It must have belonged to the house's previous owner, forgotten and left behind. Curiosity, for the first time in weeks, briefly outweighed my fear. I pried open the rusted latch. Inside wasn't memorabilia or old documents. It was a stack of at least 24 unlabeled VHS tapes. They were old, covered in a fine layer of gray dust, a relic or from a bygone era of analog recording. I was about to close the lid, dismissing them as junk, when I saw it. One tape, sitting right on top, did have a label. Scrawled across the white sticker in thick, hurried black marker were 3 words: "Do not watch." A normal person would have slammed the lid shut. A normal person would have taken the entire box to the dump. But I wasn't a normal person anymore. I was a man living on an island of impossible horror, completely alone. That warning wasn't just a threat. It was a sign. It was a message from the only other person who might have understood. The person who lived in this house before me. Did they see him too? Did they feel his faceless gaze? The warning screamed at me to stay away, but my desperation for answers screamed louder. The hope, however faint, that I was not the first, that I was not alone in this specific madness, was an irresistible siren's call. Holding that tape felt like holding a key. It might unlock my own damnation, but it was better than dying in a prison without knowing what crime I had committed. I took the tape downstairs. I had an old VCR packed away in the basement, a dusty behemoth from my childhood. It took an hour to find the right cables, but soon the machine whirred to life with a groan. I slid the tape labeled "Do Not Watch" into the slot. The machine clunked and whirred, and the TV screen flickered from blue to a storm of gray static. Then an image resolved itself through the fuzz. It was a man, probably in his late 40s, sitting in a dimly lit room. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting around as if expecting an attack at any moment. I recognized the floral wallpaper behind him. He was sitting in the same living room I was sitting in now. He wasn't speaking to an audience. He was speaking to the camera as if it were his only confidant. His voice was a ragged whisper. "It's been 6 weeks," he rasped, his own dry, hacking cough interrupting him. The static. God, the static is the worst part. It's always there now. He doesn't come inside. Not yet. But I see him from the windows, at the edge of the woods, just standing. The man suddenly grabbed the camera, the view lurching violently. He stumbled through the house, his panicked breathing the only sound besides the shuffling of his feet. He was heading for the back door. "There," he whispered, pointing the camera at the glass pane. "There, do you see it?" The camera zoomed in, the analog image degrading, warping at the edges. For a second, there was nothing but the dark line of trees in the backyard. And then I saw him, standing just as he had in my family photograph. The tall, thin figure in the black suit, the featureless white orb of a head. As the camera held on him, the audio dissolved into that familiar, deafening roar of static. The man on the tape made a choked, terrified sound. The camera fell, hitting the floor with a loud crack. The view spun to show a ceiling corner for a brief, chaotic moment before the tape cut out, replaced by the shrieking gray snow of a dead signal. I sat there in the silence, the VCR's hum the only sound in the room. I finally had my proof. I wasn't alone, but it brought no comfort. The tape wasn't a warning, it was a road map, and the man who filmed it had just reached the end of the line. The tape ended, but the silence it left behind was worse than the static. The house was no longer my home. It was a crime scene, and I was just the next victim in a long-running play. The knowledge that the previous tenant had seen him in the woods behind the house was a toxic seed. It grew into a constant gnawing awareness of the trees just beyond my backyard. Then the pull started. It wasn't a voice. It was a silent, magnetic tug on my consciousness, a deep thrumming that resonated in my bones. It was a direction, east, towards the Blackwood Pine Reserve. It was a feeling as primal and undeniable as hunger or thirst. At all hours, I would find my gaze drifting towards the windows that faced the woods. The thought of the forest became a constant low-grade hum in the back of my mind. I tried to fight it. I nailed a board over the kitchen window that looked out onto the backyard. I spent all my time in the front rooms of the house. But the compulsion grew stronger, graduating from a gentle tug to a visceral, physical need. It was a hook in my gut, pulling me forward. My own body became a traitor. I would find myself standing at the front door, hand on the doorknob, with no memory of walking across the room. The lost time was merging with this new, terrifying urge. He wasn't just taking my memories anymore. He was taking my will. Tonight the fight ended. The static in my head, which had been a constant companion, suddenly quieted. It was replaced by a pure, silent, singular command. Come. I felt myself walk to the closet, put on my jacket and shoes, and open the front door. There was no internal struggle left. My rational mind was screaming, a tiny prisoner inside a skull that was no longer its own. It knew this was a death sentence. But my feet kept moving, carrying me out into the cold night air, down the silent street, and toward the jagged black line of trees that swallowed the horizon. He's in there, I know it, and I am walking right to him. The forest swallowed me whole. One moment I was on a suburban street, the next I was surrounded by a wall of black pine, the moonlight completely suffocated by the thick canopy above. My feet moved with a steady, unnatural rhythm over the carpet of dead needles and twisted roots. It wasn't me walking. I was being walked. My body was a vehicle, and something else was behind the wheel. The woods were wrong. There were no sounds, no crickets, no rustling of small animals, not even the whisper of wind through the branches. It was a dead, vacuum-sealed silence, so profound that the only sound was the thumping of my own terrified heart and the crunch of my footsteps. The trees themselves seemed to lean in as I passed, their branches like skeletal, grasping fingers. I was led to a small, circular clearing. In the center it stood. It was taller than I could have imagined, a grotesque caricature of a man stretched vertically until it defied physics. The black suit it wore wasn't just dark, it was a patch of absolute nothingness, a hole in the fabric of the world that seemed to drink the faint light around it. And the head, the blank white faceless head, was the epicenter of all the wrongness in the universe. It was a smooth, egg-like void of identity. It did not move. It did not have to. As my feet stopped at the edge of the clearing, the static roared back to life inside my skull. It was no longer a background hum. It was a physical wave of pressure, a psychic shriek that threatened to rupture my eardrums from the inside. My vision swam with digital noise, the world fracturing into pixels. I felt a presence slip into my mind, not as a thought, but as a violation. It was cold and utterly alien, sifting through my memories, my fears, my sense of self, like a scientist dissecting a specimen. I was not being attacked. I was being browsed. In that storm of psychic static, I waited for the end. I expected a physical attack, a lunge from the impossible limbs, a final, brutal tearing apart. That is what predators do. But the silence stretched, and the attack never came. The pressure in my mind shifted from a violent intrusion to something far more insidious. It was a negotiation I had no part in, a transaction for which my soul was the only currency. That's when the realization dawned, a truth more horrifying than any quick, violent death. It didn't want to kill me. Death would be a release, an escape. This thing, this faceless void, did not deal in endings. It dealt in acquisitions. I felt its intent seep into the cracks of my consciousness like ice-cold water. There were no words, but the meaning was as clear as a scream. It was an offer, a command. It wanted me to serve. It wanted me to become a piece on its board, another set of hands and eyes in the physical world, a puppet whose strings stretched back into the static-filled darkness where it dwelled. It was showing me a future where my will was not my own, where my body would move to fulfill its silent, unknowable agenda. The memory loss, the irresistible urges, those were just the breaking-in period, the process of wearing down the lock until the door swung open. It wanted me to become one of its proxies. The term surfaced in my mind, a piece of forgotten lore from my frantic research that was now being presented as a job description. The horror of it was absolute. It wasn't offering power or knowledge. It was offering only continued existence, but as a hollowed-out shell. My mind would be a cage, and I would be forced to watch as my own hands carried out its terrible work. I don't know how I got back from the forest. There is another gap in my memory, a black space between the silent offer in the clearing and the moment I found myself back in my house, the front door wide open, the cold night air filling the rooms. But the negotiation is over. I can feel the change inside me, a fundamental rewiring of my soul. The static is no longer an external noise. It is the new rhythm of my thoughts. So I am making this recording, this narrative. All these words you are hearing are my last act of defiance before my voice is no longer my own. I am typing this out, speaking it into a microphone, leaving a digital ghost for someone, anyone, to find. This is the only thing I have left to fight with. This story is my final weapon. The cough is constant now, a deep rattling quake in my chest that leaves me dizzy. The static hums with a quiet possessiveness. Sometimes when I try to think of a word, another one is suggested. A colder word, a sharper one. My hands will reach for a coffee cup, but for a split second, they will move towards the knife block instead. The urges are not mine. The thoughts are not mine. He is wearing me like a suit, and the fit is getting better with every passing hour. I look at my own reflection and see a stranger. There is a vacancy in my eyes, a stillness that wasn't there before. I am the man from the videotape now. I am the next chapter in a story that has no end. If you find this, if you are reading this, you must understand. Do not look for him. Do not listen for the static. Burn the photos. Destroy the tapes. Every piece of his story you consume is another hook he sinks into the world. He is a virus of the mind, and belief is the disease vector. He doesn't exist until you think about him, and by then, it's already too late. This is the end of the recording, I think. My thoughts are thin, stretched. The static is so loud now, it feels like the universe is screaming in one long, continuous note. I can feel him behind my eyes. He is looking through them. He has no face of his own, so he is trying on mine. If you find this collection of words, this last little spark of me, know that I tried. I really did. Don't look for me. Do not investigate. The only way to win is to not play his game. To close your eyes, shut your ears, and convince yourself the shadows are empty. He is. The trees are so tall. The suit is so black. He has no eyes, but he sees everything. He is always watching. Alwa. The speaker's voice dissolves into a series of harsh, wet coughs. For a moment, the sound of labored breathing is audible, desperate, and ragged. Then, it is abruptly cut off, replaced by an overwhelming, deafening roar of electronic static. The sound is harsh and piercing, like 1,000 radios tuned to dead channels at once. After 10 seconds of this violent noise, the recording cuts to absolute silence.